Welcome back to another video on this channel here, the At Wits End channel. My name is Cameron. I am a graduate student of psychology, currently studying the psychology of religion and various other aspects within those pieces, as it's a little interdisciplinary in that regard. But I wanted to make a video just kind of looking at the connection between something called complex PTSD, religious residue, and religious trauma syndrome. So in continuing from my previous video that explained what religious residue was, one commenter left a comment explaining that a lot of the concepts of religious residue sounded like symptoms of complex PTSD. So I began to look into that, began to kind of explore what complex PTSD is, and the more that I looked into it, the clinical psychologist that I talked with regarding the topic, I began to agree. I think that complex PTSD, religious residue, and religious trauma syndrome are all synonyms. They're all talking about the same thing. So why the difference? Why do we have these different terms? Why is there such a gap between the various disciplines of science in which we haven't agreed on a shared term yet? And that's what I wanted to explore in this video. So sit back and let's get into my argument. Wait, dude, what's complex PTSD? What's the difference between that and PTSD? Like, don't we already have a term for that? Good question. So complex PTSD differs from PTSD, and that complex PTSD includes an expansion of symptoms and behaviors related to it. So the main difference is that individuals with complex PTSD suffer a traumatic period of time instead of a single event in their lives. Consequently, this also expands the symptoms. So, if you will, for PTSD, you have a car accident. That's a single defined event, traumatic event that may impact you for a while afterwards. Complex PTSD is typically, the best example I can explain is an example from the VA themselves. So combat veterans, those that are deployed overseas, engage in combat for their entire 9-month tour. That is 9 months of continued trauma. And so that is the main difference between complex PTSD and regular PTSD. So what do the symptoms look like? So the symptoms of complex PTSD include behavioral difficulties such as impulsivity, aggressiveness, alcohol, drug misuse, self-destructive behavior, acting out sexually, and all of those things essentially relate to coping mechanisms in some way, right? So coping with the emotion that you don't know what to do with. The second piece there is emotional difficulties. So there's often rage, depression, panic, or some sort of other extreme emotion that may not necessarily relate to the current context that you're in. The third is cognitive difficulties. So one of the main pieces of this is something called dissociation. Now, dissociation is typically understood as when an individual essentially leaves their body. So say you're in a very stressful situation. For some individuals, dissociation looks like them essentially being a third-person view of themselves, not actively controlling any of their actions, but essentially getting a top-down view, like a video game, of their own life. Now, there is another type of dissociation. So the second type of dissociation is essentially, instead of disconnecting entirely from the body, you essentially hole up in your mind. So you're not connected to how your body is feeling, the physical symptoms and responses that your body is providing. You're essentially retreating from any sort of physical stimuli into your head. The last one, or the second to last one, is interpersonal difficulties. So you can have chaotic personal relationships, which makes sense, right? So say an individual suffers from complex PTSD, they will have these seemingly random and extreme switches between various moods or emotions, and in your personal life that can wreak havoc. People don't necessarily know what to do. 1 minute everything's fine, the next you're in some sort of a traumatic response. And so this can cause real difficulties in relationships. And the last one is something called somatization. So essentially that's when you exhibit physical symptoms, but there is no physical ailment that is essentially creating those physical symptoms. So psychosomatic responses, basically. So I am so stressed about losing, say, my big toe, that my toe begins to hurt. Things like that. So that is the main symptoms of complex PTSD. Okay, that makes sense. So what types of trauma typically create the complex PTSD? Like, how does someone even get this? Great question. And this is specifically why the VA is involved. So typically, C-PTSD can be caused by childhood trauma, such as repeated abuse as a child. It's been seen in refugees of particularly war-torn environments. Concentration camps also create this. Domestic abuse survivors will often display these symptoms, and combat veterans, as I mentioned previously. Cool. So what do these symptoms actually look like in a person? Great question. So these symptoms will typically present in some form, and these are the typical presentations that we see. So emotional regulation, so persistent sadness, explosive anger, or an anger that just never seems to really go away, suicidal ideation, different things like that. You also have something that impacts consciousness, so you may forget the event. Or you may be in a state of constantly reliving the event, or you're dissociating. So the thing with complex PTSD is that you're forgetting the event, you're essentially forgetting an entire section of your life. And this can be pretty difficult to work with, right? The third presentation is self-perception. So you deal with feelings of helplessness, shame, guilt, the stigma that you're even feeling this way. And ultimately, you may even have a sense of being completely different from other human beings, and that no one can really relate to you, and a stigma and a shame around, why am I feeling like this? There wasn't really any specific thing that was necessarily really bad that I went through. And so those things compound on themselves. There's also a distorted perception of the perpetrator. So some individuals will attribute total power to the perpetrator. So what does that mean? It means that that person is a total authority. So in religious settings, right, God is a omniscient, omnipowerful, omnipresent influence. And so that is total power, or at least that is the power that is ascribed to God by the religion. They may also be preoccupied with the relationship to the perpetrator. So in instances, this may be, oh, well, they didn't mean to hurt me. It's my brother, it's my cousin, it's my dad, it's my wife. And so you essentially use the relationship that you have with this person to excuse the behavior and the abuse that occurred. The third portion of this is you can be preoccupied with revenge. So just those feelings of anger and ruminating on these pieces and wanting to enact revenge in some form. It also impacts your relations with others. So you may feel isolated. You may want to search for a rescuer. So in your relationships, right? So this is the I can fix her kind of mentality, right? So you might be looking for someone who says that, like, I'll take this burden, I'll fix this, which in itself is not a healthy way to form a relationship. And the key crux of the presentation of complex PTSD is a loss of a system of meaning. So what does that mean? It means you lose your purpose, your understanding of the world, and feel a sense of hopelessness and despair. So in regards to the process of deconversion, you're essentially losing your entire understanding of the world, how it works, your purpose in life, all at once. And so this can be very traumatic. Okay, great. So what does that have to do with religious residue? Great question. Well, since in my previous video I posited that religious residue is simply the behavioral effects of religious trauma, then it sounds like these two words are synonyms then, right? So if these are synonyms, then the mental health community needs to explore these two themes together and try to determine if they are entirely different. So we need to have studies that essentially look at what is complex PTSD. Can it be something that is related to religious trauma? And if so, which term do we prefer to use? Do we want to use religious residue, or do we want to use complex PTSD? And so that's really kind of what we're looking at, or need to look at as mental health community at large. Okay, well, what about religious trauma syndrome? Where does that fit into this? Glad you asked. So let's explore the symptoms of religious trauma syndrome, or RTS. But first, here's the definition of religious trauma again, as I mentioned in my previous video. Religious trauma is the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that are experienced by an individual as overwhelming or disruptive and have lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So the symptoms of this are self-hatred. So you're taught in these religious circles that people are inherently evil and thus untrustworthy or unworthy of love. Now this extends to you. You are people. And so you begin to internalize this idea of you suck, you can't be trusted, and you don't deserve love. This can lead to low self-esteem, depression, self-harm, or suicidal ideation. The second symptom is shame. You feel deep shame at any action you take and are unable to forgive yourself. So say you commit something, you do something that would normally be considered a sin in those environments, right? This will result in a feeling of deep guilt, of shame, and essentially reinforce the idea of self-hatred, right? So you did this because you suck. You're unworthy of love. You're a terrible human being. All humans are terrible, so of course you sinned. The third is perfectionism. This can lead to increased anxiety, stress, and setting unrealistic goals. So because you're aware that you are not good, you're terrible, but you're supposed to strive to be good for God, you're going to essentially continue to try and hit these impossible standards that are set forth by God. And when you never reach those, it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of self-hatred, shame, all of these things. The next symptom is hypervigilance. So this is a constant state of anxiety meant to protect a person from perceived or actual threats of harm. So, for example, whenever I enter a new environment, a new class, a new school, new job, I always go to the corner of the room, take a chair that gives me a view of the exits and everyone coming in and out. So essentially, my automatic reaction is to look for threats, to be in a position to where I can identify a threat early and get out of the way quickly. This is what's considered hypervigilance. So there's a constant state of anxiety looking for some sort of threat or harm that may come to you. And when you're taught that the world is evil and wants to hurt you for being a Christian, anywhere you go, you're going to feel like that. You also have difficulty making decisions. So after deconstructing or leaving a religion, right, your moral system is different. So there is no clear right and wrong anymore. Everything's in an unclear gray scale, right? You no longer are in this binary mode of thinking. So you're essentially constantly trying to figure out, what do I want? What do I want to do? But the problem is when you've been taught to ignore that your entire life or during this entire period within this religion, you don't trust your normal instincts and reactions. The next symptom is a loss of community. This is fairly obvious. If you leave the religion, you tend to get kicked out of the church. And this feeling of social isolation is very difficult to deal with. You will also have a lack of boundaries, right? So over the course, you're taught to ignore any boundaries that you may have because they may get in the way of glorifying God. So, for example, in terms of volunteering with the church, right? Say you're really tired and you don't have the energy or the mental bandwidth that day to volunteer with the church. Typically, you're guilted or guilt-tripped into still coming even though you're miserable. So this is kind of a gradual erosion of boundaries being ignored or crossed. And this becomes the norm for you to the point to where you don't even bother setting boundaries anymore. So these are essentially the main symptoms of religious trauma syndrome. So do a lot of these sound familiar? A lot of these symptoms sound very familiar to the first one I went over in this video. So let's look at a Venn diagram of the symptoms. Oh, look at that, it's a circle. So why aren't we using this language? Why the disagreement? Well, Dr. Ramler discusses this in her article, When God Hurts, the Rhetoric of Religious Trauma as Epistemic Pain. A lot of big words. I understood maybe 4 of those. So let's break it down. What are the arguments she makes in the paper? So in the paper, Dr. Ramler discusses 2 key terms, as well as their connection, or rather the disconnect, that is occurring within the mental health research area. These 2 terms are testimonial silencing and hermeneutical marginalization. What? Yeah, exactly. Let me break it down. So testimonial silencing is essentially when someone shares their story and they are either not believed or the fault is turned back on the individual sharing their story. Dr. Ramler uses an example of a woman sharing her testimony of sexual abuse in childhood. However, when this woman shared her story, the person she confided in, who was trusted to her at the time, responded with, "Oh, maybe you're faking it. Maybe this is a false memory." You remember that study in the 90s? Kids remember stuff about sex wrong all the time. Right. So this essentially invalidated the feelings and the story of this woman and resulted in her doubting her own story. In essence, all the power was taken away from her in a couple short sentences, and she was thrust back into this cycle of religious trauma, complex PTSD, religious residue. Jesus, that's awful. So how does this fit into the previous stuff that we talked about? Glad you asked. Does this example sound like any symptoms we discussed previously, or the cause of some of these symptoms? Absolutely. It sounds like shame. This essentially shifts the burden of guilt or blame from the abuser to the abusee. It also reinforces the idea for the abusee that other people are not to be trusted. You cannot share your story because you will not be believed. Not only will you not be believed, it'll be your fault that it happened. For someone already struggling with the event to begin with, this is the worst possible response and will likely re-traumatize the individual. It essentially reinforces already the symptoms that they're already experiencing. They attempted to break this cycle of symptoms that they're dealing with, and instead of being seen, heard, and validated, essentially the same symptoms and their worst fears and insecurities were confirmed in just a couple short sentences. Okay, what about the other big word, the Hassenpfeffer thing? You got it. Hermeneutical marginalization. Big word, let's break it down. A hermeneutic is essentially a way of interpreting. Think of it as the lens you use for a camera. Depending on the lens, the image will change. Another example is filters, right? Like those fun Snapchat filters, a little dog one. They change how you look. They change how you see things. They change how you interpret things, right? So what is that in the context of marginalization? So this is essentially when information is censored or alternative information is provided and presented as the only information and interpretation. Okay, so what does that look like? So the example that Dr. Ramler gives is an individual who was provided education on young earth creationism when they were homeschooled all through their grade school years. So young earth creationism is the idea that the earth is roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years old. It was created by God in 6 literal 24-hour days. You may have heard of the Creation Museum. Essentially, this is what that museum is attempting to prove. So when this individual got older and went to college, they realized that this was but one interpretation, and it did not align with scientific thought and studies. As a result, When they realized this, they felt a sense of anger, resentment, and betrayal. And so they confronted their parents about it. And the parents essentially said, well, you were taught to have critical thinking. You should have been able to have figured this out yourself. That's kind of wild, but what does all that mean? What Dr. Ramler argues is that there was a failure to connect with their child when they expressed doubts about the interpretation presented, and then blamed the child for not thinking for themselves. So there's a similarity here, right? The blame is shifted. It's put back on the individual. And so this essentially, again, reconfirms the trauma responses that those individuals are likely already exhibiting. It reinforces the idea of self-doubt. It shifts the blame back onto the individual. Everything is the individual's fault, not the failure of the authority figure to connect with the individual and present other interpretations. So, to break this down succinctly, Dr. Ramler argues that the main cause of pain from religious trauma is that when an individual speaks out about the discomfort and they are not believed, this causes deep pain and lasting scars. In essence, the environment of authoritarian churches results in recurring pain due to not being believed. This results in individuals eventually learning not to share their experiences, and that it is their fault when something bad happens. Does this sound familiar? This is common rhetoric within evangelical and fundamentalist churches. If something bad happens, it's because you haven't confessed to a specific sin in your life. Or, if something bad happens, it's God testing you, and you should be happy to be going through this trial, as it will make you a better Christian. Does it? Absolutely not. These instances directly contribute to hypervigilance symptoms, to perfectionist symptoms, to difficulties in forming relationships. These things compound over time. This is what leads to complex PTSD, or rather, religious residue. The final point that Dr. Ramler argues is that language is important. If those sharing their stories do not know the rhetoric that is used in academic circles, then these stories may go unnoticed by academic circles, the very people that need to be studying this. Dr. Ramler argues that because of these differences in language, mental health researchers have not understood the distinctive need for research in the area of religious trauma and harm. If we can collectively agree on a set of terms, then the research can flow more easily and we can reduce the gaps across the disciplines. And more effectively address the problems people are speaking up about in sharing their stories. The most important component is that when people share their stories, they can finally be validated and heard. This ends the cycle of shame and self-doubt that many experience as a result of religious trauma. Okay, so what do we do now, though? First, I want to make this abundantly clear. If you have shared your story about religious abuse and religious trauma, I see you, I hear you, and I believe you. Thank you for sharing your story. I know how hard that is to do, especially when you've been repeatedly not believed or told it's all your fault. There are resources out there to help, such as the Recovering from Religion Support Group, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and the Secular Therapist Network. I urge you to explore these and connect with others who have a similar experience. We'd love to have you. I've also provided sources for these resources I used to create this video, and we'll link them down below. As always, please feel safe to share your story in the comments, and I wish you the best in your journey to healing. Please feel free to also suggest topics that you think would be helpful for you in your journey through deconstruction and post-deconstruction. I want this channel to be a space where people can share their stories, connect with others, but also so that I can address concerns or difficulties that you're dealing with in your life from both an academic standpoint and a personal experience. I want to make sure that the language gap is filled or closed. I want to be able to take these academic sources and their jargon and the dense material to read through and put it in a format that is a lot easier to digest and understand. If I succeed in doing that, then that's all I hope for. That was the entire point of this channel. So please, if you like what you've seen so far, subscribe, give it a like, leave me a comment on how I can do better, your own story, and things you'd like to see me go over on this channel. So thanks again, and I wish you the best on this journey.